In this video, we will review some basic concepts of deep learning. In the previous sub-modules, we explored algorithms of what is known as traditional machine learning or classical machine learning. Deep learning is a subfield of machine learning, but uses algorithms called artificial neural networks, which are inspired by how the human brain works. At its core, deep learning constructs layer representations of the data where complex features are built hierarchical from simple ones. Each layer, depicted by these columns of circles here, or of nodes, consists of multiple nonlinear processing units. Each layer output is fed into the next as the input. Unlike traditional machine learning models that rely on handcrafted feature selections, deep learning methods learn these features directly from the raw data. In this example, we have, for example, data about a secondary structure, protein secondary structure, and we have to classify whether it's a helix, beta strand, or coil. Deep learning tries to understand the representation in the data itself by learning mapping from inputs to the output, instead of relying on the expert knowledge to do the feature extraction. Because of this representational learning, deep learning is especially good at learning patterns from large amounts of data. It becomes more powerful with more data. We can see here that the performance increases with the amount of training data, as opposed to classical or traditional machine learning that it plateaus with more data. Robust frameworks like TensorFlow allow us to implement this architecture at scale, enabling applications in areas from classification to anomaly detection. Artificial neural networks as I mentioned before, try to mimic the brain's neuron and are made up of layers of nodes, as shown in this graph. They are connected with weights and activation functions. The learning process involves adjusting these weights to minimize a loss function. Essentially, the model is learning from its mistakes. The objective of learning for the network is to optimize the cost function or reduce the errors, and the weights are updated in the learning process. We're going to focus now on the components of a layer. We have the input, the neurons or the nodes, the layers, and the output. Each neuron in a deep learning model computes a weight sum of inputs plus a bias. The weight is depicted with a W here. The input is X in this case. B is the bias, which is a special kind of weight. And Y, in this example, is the value the neuron ultimately outputs. The neuron sums up all the values it receives through its connections. This neuron's activations is, in this case, a linear function, which is y equals the weights times the input plus the bias. If we have multiple input features, like the example below, with different weights, we can add more input connections to the neuron by multiplying each input to its connection weight and sum them up, like we have in this equation. This is just one example. A linear unit with two inputs will fit a plane, while a unit with multiple inputs will fit a hyperplane. Now let's move to the layers. Neural networks typically organize their neurons into layers. The layers in a neural network transform data progressively via an activation function. After receiving input, the neurons use the activation functions such as sigma, ReLU, or tan to decide whether to pass the information to the next layer. This adds non-linearity. By stacking layers, the network can model increasingly complex functions. The layers before the output layers, the ones that are lighter here, before the output layer, are called hidden layers since we never see their outputs directly. Let's talk about the flow of the information in the neural networks. There are two flows in neural networks. One is forward propagation, the other is back propagation or backward flow. In forward propagation, the inputs move through the layers to produce the output. The input data, which could be an image, a vector, or sequence, is passed from the input layer through the hidden layers, in this case in orange, to the output layer. In each neuron computes a weight sum of its input, applies the activation function to produce the output. This output becomes the input for the next layer. At the end, we get the final output, which is the prediction produced. In backpropagation, on the other hand, it updates the weights based on the output error. And this iterative process, guided by the loss function, allows the model to improve. So now that we know the basic of a neuron and layers, we're going to see just a small sample of different architectures that you might encounter. The first one we're going to review is the one of the simplest one, but is foundational for deep learning. Is called multi-layer perceptron. This is a fully connected feed-forward network with at least one hidden layer. In this case, the layer on the bottom is the input layer, the X, then the hidden layer is the H, and then the output layer is with O. As you can see, all the nodes are fully connected to the nodes in the next layer. Each neuron is a nonlinear functional processing unit. They are universal function approximators and serve as a base for more complex networks. Another architecture is convolutional neural networks, or CNN. These are designed for spatial data like images. They consist on convolution layers that capture spatial hierarchies, pooling layers that reduce the dimensionality, and fully connected layers for classification. The multiple convolutional layers, which are the first ones encounters, consist of multiple filters that are convolved across the height and the width of the input data, by basically computing a dot product to give two-dimensional activation map. By stacking all the maps across all the filters, we get a final output from a convolutional layer. The pooling layers perform nonlinear downsampling to reduce the input size and number of parameters from the convolutional layer. Filters go through the height and width of the input and reduce it by taking an aggregate like sum, average, or max. The fully connected multi-layer perceptrons are the last step, which are for classification. These are, or object recognition, these are fully connected. In this case, in this example, we have an image of a car, and we're trying to classify between these different classes. A probability for each class is the output. Recurrent neural networks are well suited for sequential data, like sequences, time series, or text. They have this loop architecture that allows them to carry the information from previous steps forward, capturing some temporal dependencies. These looped networks are called recurrent because they perform the same operations and computations for each and every element in the sequence of input data. The recurrent neural networks have memory to capture information from past sequences. However, it is unable to remember information over many time steps. The long short-term memory network, or LSTMs, are an improved form of recurrent neural network. They can retain information over long sequences and address the vanishing gradient problem of the recurrent neural networks. This makes them ideal for language modeling or any task requiring long-term memory. As we mentioned before, as the sequence, for example, sequence is increasing, the recurrent neural network loses historical context over time. And the LSTMs can remember the information from really long sequence-based data and prevent issues like the vanishing gradient problem in the training with backpropagation. The last architecture we're going to review is the encoder-decoder architecture known as transformer. It's made up of multiple layers of self-attention and feed-forward neural networks. The input is at the bottom, and you can see that this is a feed-forward mechanism, and these are the attention modules. In the encoder, it takes a variable length sequence as the input, and it transforms it into a state with a fixed shape. The second component, it maps the encoded state of a fixed shape to a variable length sequence. The objective is to learn data representation approximations and encoding. It can be used for building generative models, performing dimensionality reduction, and detecting anomaly. The transformer revolutionized the deep learning with the self-attention mechanism because unlike the recurrent networks, they process sequences in parallel and capture dependency more effectively. They are foundational to models like BERT and GPT. Now we're going to review some of the hyperparameters at different levels. Hyperparameters related to model architecture, hyperparameters related to training, and hyperparameters related to regularization. The activation function captures nonlinear pattern and is applied to layer outputs. These are different functions. We mentioned before sigmoid, tan, and ReLU, but there are others, and these functions, as mentioned before, adds some nonlinearity and allows to address more complex problems. By combining dense layers with nonlinear activations, we can create powerful transformation. The final layer is a linear unit, meaning no activation function, that makes this network appropriate for to a regression task, for example. We are trying to predict a numeric value. Another task like classification, it might require an activation function at the output as well. The loss function measures the model's error, and this is a hyperparameter that has to do with the training. One common loss of function for regression problem is the mean absolute error. It basically captures the absolute difference between the true target value and the predicted one, which would be this line. And the total loss on the dataset is the mean for all these absolute differences. It is called absolute because it is the magnitude of error, not the direction. During training, the model will use the loss function as a guide for finding the correct values for its weights. The loss function gives a direct sense of how off your predictions are on average. The optimizer is an algorithm that adjusts the weights to minimize the loss. Virtually all the optimization algorithms used in deep learning belongs to a family called stochastic gradient descent, or SGD. They are iterative algorithms that train a network in steps. In this optimization method, one training sample called mini-batch is passed through the neural network at a time to make predictions, and the parameters, the weight of each layer, are updated with the computed gradient. It is iterated over n times for n training samples in the training set. For each iteration, the sample of training data is called, as I mentioned, mini-batch or just batch, while a complete round of going through the training data is called an epoch. The number of epochs you train for is how many times the network will see each training example. And this is one of the hyperparameters that you can set. The learning rate and batch size are two hyperparameters that are very critical. Learning rate controls the step size in weight updates. The batch size determines how many samples we use per update. One of the SGD algorithms called ADAM adaptively adjusts the learning rate and generally performs well. In the case of the learning rate, a smaller learning rate means the network needs to see more mini-batches before its weights converge to their best values. Now let's look at the information in the training data. Just for information purposes, we have the signal and the noise. The signal is a part of the data that helps generalize to new examples, whereas the noise is the data-specific randomness. The good models will learn the signal, not the noise. By plotting the loss over time for both the training and validation data, we can diagnose underfitting and overfitting. Remember, we learned about those on the traditional machine learning. Here's an example of the loss versus the epochs, number of epochs, and we look at the training and validation. A growing gap between the two curves often indicates the model is learning noise. This is the same graph, but now we indicate which area is underfitting and which area is overfitting. This is capturing noise. To prevent this overfitting, we monitor validation loss during training. When it stops decreasing, here is decreasing. When it stops decreasing, we halt training and restore the best weights. This is called early stopping. This ensures that the model won't continue to learn noise and overfit the data. Besides preventing overfitting from training too long, early stopping can also prevent underfitting from not training long enough. Just set your training epochs to some large number, more than you'll need, and early stopping will take care of the rest. Dropouts combats overfitting by randomly deactivating neurons during training. This encourages the model to learn robust features rather than memorizing the training data. It forces the neural network to search for broad general patterns whose weight patterns tend to be more robust. The predictions will no longer be made by one big network, but instead by a committee of smaller networks, making decisions by the committee as a whole better than any individual. Batch normalization, it is generally a good idea to put all your data on a common scale. And batch normalization layer looks at each batch as it comes in, first normalizing the batch with its own mean and standard deviation, and then putting the data on a new scale. Batch norm standardize layer inputs during training, helping speed up convergence and reducing internal covariance shift. This mind gap summarizes key deep learning concepts and architectures from the multi-layer perceptrons to transformers and help reinforce their interconnections. This last slide shows DeepChem, which provides tools for applying deep learning in the sciences, especially chemistry and biology. With it, you can predict molecule properties, analyze protein structures, and more. Originally, it was focused for chemistry, but then the project slowly evolved past its route to broader applications. So these are some of the applications, and we might use this in the exercises and tutorials. Here are the references. Thank you.